Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to the third episode of Games as Lit 101's deep dive into The World Ends With You. We've been working through the story of The World Ends With You and analyzing it as we go. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, I highly recommend you go back to part 1 and start there, as the concepts we're going to be talking about in this video build off the things that we've established in the previous ones. In case you're following along with this series while playing through Final Remix, this video is going to cover the events of the game through the end of Week 2. So if you haven't gotten to that point yet and you're trying to avoid spoilers, which I do highly recommend, I'd suggest holding off on this video until you get to at least that point in the game. Quick recap. We went through the first week of The World Ends With You, Neku's first game, and examined what his worldview was and how it changed through his time with Shiki. At the end of that game, Shiki was given a second chance at life, Beat became a Reaper, and Neku decided to play the game again. But his priorities had changed, and Shiki was his entry fee for this game. So now he's playing for himself as well as her. In the second episode, we talked about the game's battle system and other mechanics, and talked about how they're used as a metaphor and reinforcement for the game's story and themes. Which means now it's time to talk about Neku's second game, and this guy. So let's get back into the UG and learn how to work with difficult people that make us wish we had Shiki back. This is Week 2 of The World Ends With You. As we established, Week 2 begins with Neku waking up back in the middle of Scramble Crossing at the beginning of a new game. But Neku knows how this works now, so when he gets a strange algebraic mission for the day, he immediately begins searching for a partner. Again, the character has come a long way since ignoring Shiki at the beginning. He has trouble finding anyone, but suddenly a pact forms without his even realizing it's happening until it does. His partner for this game is Joshua, and Joshua is... Neku does not find Joshua as easy to get along with as Shiki. His conflict with Shiki was just a matter of Neku's own issues. Shiki herself was really kind and easy to get along with. Joshua, on the other hand, helps himself to a pact without ever asking Neku, talks to him in a very patronizing manner, and generally is just a smug little know-it-all. His speech has a veneer of civility, but just below the surface is a prideful, passive-aggressive self-importance that regularly makes itself seen. It doesn't take long to pick up on the fact that if Week 1 was Neku learning to value other people as human beings, Week 2 is about him learning to work with people that are a little more difficult. There's a bit more to it than that, but for now at least the game is setting up that much pretty immediately. The mathematical mission turns out to be a simple repeat. Get to 10-4. Joshua goes on about how lucky Neku is to have found him as a partner, and as Neku grows more frustrated, he tries to scan Joshua. Unlike other players, he actually can, but he can't actually pick up any thoughts. Instead, he gets a flash image of some place he doesn't recognize. Neku's frustration grows into suspicion. Once they get to 10-4, we're introduced to the game master for this game, Sho Minamoto, a math-obsessed artist who piles junk in the center of 10-4 for his art and uses math slang for basically everything. He accuses Neku and Joshua of being so Zeta slow, and actually seems to recognize Joshua, asking if he's a player this time and calling his presence a happy miscalculation. Also, it's time to die. Minamoto, or as Neku calls him in reference to his junk pile art, the Grim Heaper, is a bit more of an enjoyable villain than the previous Game Master. He's not so grim and making weird food analogies and saying things like the pudding of their doom. He's more openly zany and constantly making deep-cut math references. In any case, suspicious as Neku is, he ends the first day relatively optimistic. Trust your partner, he repeats to himself. He'll do what it takes to get through the game and get a new life for both himself and Shiki. On the second day, we see Kariya and Uzuki talking. Apparently, Minamoto has been closing off areas without telling the Reapers, and has ordered them not to send noise after players. Kariya is fine with this because he's lazy, whereas Uzuki enjoys her job too much and is annoyed. Back with Neku, he wakes up to see Joshua on the phone, and his suspicion deepens, since players' phones don't work for calls or texts in the UG aside from receiving the missions. What's more, he's talking about the time limit and what areas are cut off, which makes Neku suspect he's talking to the Reapers. Upon trying to scan him again, Neku sees that place again, this time with a player pin dropping onto his own body. He recognizes the place this time as Utagawa and realizes this must be the memory of his own death, which he still doesn't remember even after getting his memories back at the end of Week 1. The implications of the fact that he's getting these memories from Joshua's mind are not lost on him, but he keeps it to himself. he and Joshua still need to work together to get through the game. For his part, though, Joshua isn't making that cooperation easy. He keeps wanting to ignore the mission and go off on his own quest that he's not even explaining to Neku. When Neku explains that Shiki was taken, even takes personal responsibility for it, Joshua is less than understanding. "Did you think you were special?" he asks. Every player here put up something they loved. Everybody makes sacrifices. Neku, again having made immense progress, gets upset that he would regard Shiki as a sacrifice instead of a person in need. But Neku composes himself. Joshua isn't entirely wrong after all, and again, trust your partner. As the day progresses, a new kind of noise shows up. It's called taboo noise, and it's far more powerful. But this dark note is soon alleviated because the day's mission is to win a Tin Pin Slammer tournament. All good JRPGs need some kind of minigame, and this is it for The World Ends With You, a silly game about knocking each other's pins off the board. The whole thing is really only notable for two reasons. First, it officially introduces us to Shuto Dan, or Shooter, this kid who's really obsessed with Tin Pin Slammer, and also introduces us to Sota and Nao, two other players in the game. All these characters were seen before when Makoto was trying to make that red pin popular, but not officially introduced. And second, it further highlights the difference between how seriously Neku is taking this, as Joshua mocks him for being so super serious about winning a kids game in a tournament full of 5th graders. Neku ultimately loses, but Sato wins the tournament with the help of Joshua's sabotage of Shooter's pins, so the mission is completed. The next video in this series is going to cover the various side stories and supporting characters in the game, so we'll get more into this stuff then, but Sato and Nao are more than important enough to the events of Week 2 that they're worth bringing up. Neku agrees to do Joshua's thing next, but Sho shows up with one of his junk piles and messes up their plans. He really just taunts them a bit with his weird math references, but still, it delays them. Joshua says he must have a thing for Neku, but muses about whether it's actually his own fault instead. And we end day 3 of the second week with Beat getting his first mission as a Reaper: destroy the ones you called friends. The mission for the next day is to get to Cat Street in 15 minutes. Seeing as that's on the other side of Shibuya, Neku and Joshua book it over there, but it turns out it wasn't even a mission. Joshua sent that text because Cat Street was where he'd been wanting to go this whole time. Neku is understandably upset, but since they haven't yet gotten an official mission, he plays along. Turns out, Cat Street is where Mr. Hanakoma has his cafe, and Joshua has been talking to him on the phone and trying to see him since the beginning of the game. It's clear Mr. Hanakoma and Joshua go way back, which soothes Neku's suspicions a bit since he trusts Mr. H. Okay, so I know that we'll talk about this later has become something of a running joke in this series, but this scene is probably the most important in the entire game. It provides us with some answers, distracts us from some others, introduces some very important ideas, and includes what I would probably argue is the game's thesis statement. So I am going to cover it briefly here, but you can bet we're going to be coming back to it in a lot more detail multiple times going forward in this video series. First, we get some explanation about Joshua, specifically that he's always been able to see what's going on in the UG, even while he was alive. This is why he knows so much about the game, and why he knows Mr. H so well. He was the only person he could talk to about it. Second, Mr. Hanakoma talks to Neku about the importance of trusting his partner again, and along the way drops the line, "Enjoy every moment with all you got." Neku is surprised to hear him say this because it's the motto of an artist called Cat, and the mantra by which Neku supposedly lives his life. Third, the title drop. Listen up, phones. The world ends with you. If you want to enjoy life, expand your world. You gotta push your horizons out as far as they'll go. Like I said, we'll return to this later. And fourth, Joshua's reason for coming here. Mr. Hanakoma has updated both Joshua and Neku's phones with some kind of tracker, though Joshua is playing coy about exactly what it tracks. On their way out of Cat Street, Beat attacks them, but just leaves once Neku and Joshua defend themselves from him for a bit, saying they're not even strong enough to be worth it. The tracker responds to more of those trash heaps Minamoto's been making, but they're not what Joshua's looking for. The rest of this day is comprised of more thematically relevant but not plot-important shenanigans revolving around a bitter competition between two ramen shops. We'll be covering it in detail in the next episode, but for now, it's important to note that Makoto has been making those red player pins even more popular in Shibuya, turned into kind of a jerk, and is providing us an object lesson to expand on the game's commentary about how our lives interact with the culture around us. Joshua's tracker responds to those red player pins, but they're not what he's looking for either, and no mission shows up throughout the entire day. Turns out, Minamoto has gone completely AWOL, and the only reason players are still getting erased is because of the taboo noise, which he's suspected of summoning, which means the next day there is once again no mission. Joshua explains that he's using the trackers to try and find something called the Shibuya River, so he can, in his words, jack Shibuya. There's more side character stuff. Beat attacks them again and retreats again, accidentally leaving behind Rhyme's pendant, and we find out about a feature Mr. H put on the phones that lets them take pictures and see what happened in that location at specific times in the past. It's mostly a little gameplay gimmick, but it'll come into play later. They work their way to Utagawa, and Neku once again sees a flashback with a little more detail this time. Neku staring at Kat's mural, and Joshua running up with a pistol and shooting him. Neku is sure now that he's partnered to his killer, but refuses to bring it up out of the necessity of continuing to work with Joshua. And for the record, this is the kind of thing I would have liked to see a little more of with Shiki in week 1. Neku is trying to trust Joshua and work together with him, but he also knows that Joshua is a threat to him, and he's trying to reconcile that trust and cooperation with what Joshua did to him. I just would have liked to see that struggle acknowledged a little more with Shiki in week 1 after Neku tried to murder her. On the 5th day, Neku demands some answers, and Joshua gives some. He intends to take control of the Shibuya UG from the conductor, and he should be at the Shibuya River, a confluence of energy in the UG. They see Mr. H to get the sensors recalibrated, and Joshua explains that he joined the game intentionally. Having grown up seeing it, he, in his own words, began to see its charm, and decided that this is where he actually belongs. He refuses to explain how he died, saying he's here because he wants to be, and that's that. Beat attacks again later, which goes as usual, and he's about to just leave them alone again, when Neku gives him the bell pendant Rhyme used to wear. He figured it's important to Beat, and he didn't want him to be without it. Beat is taken aback by this act of kindness as he leaves. A bit later, we find out something important. Mr. Hanakoma is Kat, the artist that Neku respects so much. Which of course kind of blows Neku's mind, but we won't really understand the implications of that until later in the story. Soon after, they find the Shibuya River, which is basically just a confluence of energy in the UG, but there's a wall blocking it and they can't get through, so they turn back for now. They're also attacked by more taboo noise, which they can't overcome until Joshua gets desperate enough to blast it all away, all on his own somehow. Turns out this was a setup by Karya, who wanted to confirm a suspicion. Joshua is still alive. This triggers another conversation that displays how flippant Joshua is about all of this, and how his refusal to take the game seriously jeopardizes Neku's mission to save Shiki. And Neku gets worked up enough to tell Joshua that he knows he killed him. To which Joshua basically says, "Even if I did, what would you do about it?" And the day ends. On day 6, everything is coming to a head, specifically because the taboo noise are more numerous and actively attacking players and Reapers alike. We come across Sota and Nao just in time to see Nao erased, and whether we help Sota or not, he is, of course, doomed. Minamoto finally shows up again to taunt them, since the final day is next and he'll be able to fight them directly. And indeed, the mission on day 7 is to erase Minamoto. So they make their way to him, only to find him still preparing for the final battle. The mission wasn't given out by him. It seems the conductor had enough of his shenanigans and intervened by sending out a mission to defeat him. But before the battle gets underway, Minamoto gives Neku another flashback to Utagawa, where he sees that Minamoto was there when he died too. And Joshua wasn't trying to kill Neku, he was trying to kill Minamoto. Minamoto is the one who killed Neku. So Neku and Joshua fight him, but as they're about to defeat him, he goes off about his master plan and prepares to self-destruct with what Joshua describes as an imaginary number level psych. Like the game's dialogue uses the symbol for an imaginary number, I'm not necessarily sure how that would be said out loud. Point is, it's incredibly powerful and there doesn't seem to be a way to survive it. So Joshua pushes Neku out of the way.
But Neku, I thought you couldn't afford to lose. Give up on yourself. And you give up on the world.
And once again, Neku wakes up in Scramble Crossing on day 1, alone. Alright, so like the first video, we're going to have to go a little bit into some flashbacks in the beginning of week 3 in order to fully understand what happened at the end of week 2. So if you're not quite there in the game yet, feel free to pause the video and come back after you've gotten a little further in the game. What it mostly comes down to is that Neku was cheated out of his freedom. Joshua took the attack, sacrificing himself and getting Neku out of harm's way. But Joshua, the conductor points out, was breaking the rules by playing the game in the first place. He snuck in while still alive, and that breach of the game's rules invalidates its outcome. The conductor even considers Neku an accomplice to that crime, but because he eliminated Minamoto, he's given one final chance to enter the game again. His entry fee this time? All of the other players. Of course, there's plenty to dig into here, so let's get into the analysis. Week 2 is a complicated one to unpack, for two particular reasons. Firstly, Neku is at something of a crossroads between his old worldview, his newfound appreciation for others, and his attempts to understand and work with a legitimately difficult person. So his thoughts and beliefs are all over the map as he's trying to figure all of this out for himself. And secondly, a lot of what we found out this week is a lie. You'll understand what I mean when we get to week 3. For now, we'll once again focus on Neku, and unlike the first week, we'll be talking pretty exclusively about him. Beat's story has yet to really come into focus, and Joshua is not so much a character with a fully formed arc as he is a catalyst for world building and a complication for Neku's further development. At least for now. We'll be talking more about Joshua eventually, but today, Neku will be the focus. Since we spent the first episode establishing Neku's worldview and how it changed in response to his time with Shiki, we're going to be focusing primarily in this episode on the shaky ground Neku is standing on here, and how his journey towards betterment is influenced by Joshua's antagonism and the continually shifting circumstances surrounding them both. We see all throughout the second week that Neku is caught between his old and new selves. This is a sensible enough place for Neku to be in at this point. His character arc in the first week stands well on its own and came to a fairly satisfactory conclusion, and the fact that Shiki was taken as Neku's entry fee shows that he's come a long way since the beginning, but no one changes completely that quickly. He still has work to do. And ultimately, Shiki was easy mode. Neku learned to recognize the value in other people through his time with a kind, caring, dedicated person. And we do see the effects of what he's learned reflected in his actions. There's a great little scene where the man who runs Ramen Don is feeling down, and Neku is ready to just walk away when he remembers Shiki saying that sometimes people just need a good listener. So he turns back around and offers to hear what he's going through. We see little proofs like this all throughout week 2, and we know that Neku learned from his experiences in week 1. But we also see him repeat a lot of his old beliefs, and the catalyst for such moments is almost always Joshua. In a sense, Joshua represents Neku's old worldview, here to haunt him and regress him back to the way he used to see the world, but it's also a little more complicated and sinister than that. Let's talk about the relationship between these two characters. For starters, Joshua literally forces himself into Neku's life. The pact forms without Neku trying, agreeing, or even being aware of who it's with until it's already made. As Joshua says, he simply helped himself. This isn't a great start to a partnership. This should have been Neku's chance to work with someone he chose, someone he could be a good partner to, someone he could trust. Instead, he had this relationship forced upon him, a contentious start to a contentious partnership, to say the absolute least. Joshua is constantly lying to Neku, obscuring the truth from him, and talking down to him, and this makes things difficult for sure, but it's only a small part of what actually makes him so bad for Neku. Joshua and Neku have a great number of very important and revealing conversations over the course of week 2, and this is mostly where we start to see how conflicted Neku is. In fact, we see that a pattern starts to form whenever Joshua and Neku talk about relating to other people. During the whole ramen thing, Joshua says that everyone has their own little internal world, a secret garden only they can enter. Each world follows its own internal logic, individuality, and the logic of one world means nothing in another. Understanding people isn't hard, Neku. It's impossible. And Neku agrees with this entirely, even saying, "It's just easier on my own. Nobody else's baggage, nobody else tying me down. People aren't meant to figure each other out." Joshua agrees with this as well. It's not until the end of the day that Neku ends one of these internal monologues with, "My world's all I need." Unless, before getting cut off, he's still having these feelings and still valuing isolationism over interconnectivity, but his progress isn't completely erased. He's hesitating now, thinking twice. Later on, the two run into Sota and Nao, the former of which was the one who won that tin pin tournament earlier. Joshua tells them that only one person will get to go back at the end of the week, and tells them that makes everyone competition, including each other. Thankfully, Sota and Nao are too emotionally mature for that BS, and both indicate they'd happily play the game over again for each other, and when Neku explains what happened with Shiki, they even say they'd gladly be each other's entry fees, because partners help each other do whatever it takes to get each other back to the RG. And one final thought that sticks with Neku. We all want to be alive again. Nobody deserves it most, right? In this scenario, we see that Neku is essentially applying his old "other people only hold you back" mantra to himself. He sees himself as holding Shiki back, which is progress, I suppose, in a sense, but it's still being misapplied. It takes this encounter for him to realize that friends support each other, and Shiki would no less give up on him than he would give up on her. He's not holding her back because this is what friends do. They dedicate themselves in part or in whole to each other's betterment. Neku is learning to get past the resentment he feels toward others for requiring something of him, and now he's learning that goes both ways. That his friends are as dedicated and forgiving of him as he's learning to be of them. So again, we see Joshua trying to apply this cynical, self-centered worldview to the situation, and Neku going along with it at first, but ultimately setting himself back on the path that Shiki and Mr. Hanakoma have set him on. After Neku further displays his progress by being understanding rather than judgmental of Beat's choice to become a Reaper, Joshua once again prompts Neku into agreeing with some regressive stuff. As long as we all have our own worlds, he says, people will never really understand each other. Neku's response is affirmative. They're them and I'm me. Talking to them gets me nothing. But again, he follows this up with a second thought. I don't feel that way anymore. Since coming to the UG, reading people's minds, Shibuya's full of people with just as many viewpoints. Mr. H said the world ends with me. To expand my world, I have to learn to look farther, not write off other people's values as inferior. Maybe I had it backwards. Maybe I need to open up to really enjoy... He got cut off by something else there, but you get the point. This week isn't so much about progress for Neku as it is a tug of war between his old and new selves. He's on his way to a better outlook, but he's still working on it, and Joshua has entered his life to essentially affirm his old worldview in a rather convincing and dangerous way. This is what I meant when I said that Joshua's a little more complicated than just representing Neku's regressive tendencies. He's a fully formed, functioning model of Neku's old, broken, and legitimately harmful worldview, and that is way worse. Here's the thing. Being wrong is one thing. We're all wrong sometimes, it's normal, and it's not great, and it can cause harm, but for the most part, it's not particularly dangerous or damaging. It's just a thing that we all do sometimes. Neku's original worldview is wrong. It's profoundly and fundamentally flawed, but it's also not particularly well thought out. He just wants to do his own thing, and he shuts out anything and anyone that gets in the way of that. But sometimes when one believes something erroneous or damaging, they actually build an entire philosophy around it as justification for it. Then it becomes more than a mistake, more than something that one idly thinks because they haven't really realized the problems with it, and turns into a full-fledged worldview based on a false premise. And that's a significantly bigger problem. That's why Joshua is so bad for Neku. Joshua essentially believes the same things that Neku did at the beginning of the game, but he's actually thought them through. He knows why he believes that people aren't worth it, and why he believes that it's impossible to understand others. He has an entire philosophy based on it. It's gone from a bad idea to a full ideology based on a bad idea. Just as bad, but more convincing, more deeply ingrained, and harder to refute. This is how radicalization happens. Someone has prejudices, perhaps even mild to the point of invisibility, maybe based on misinformation or baseless assumptions or possibly an unfortunate personal experience. Then they come across someone who espouses and explains an ideology that supports those ideas and provides a framework for why those prejudices fit into an explanation of how the world works. And suddenly this person finds themselves with words and systems to explain their prejudices, and they go from a person with some bad ideas to a person who's living their life based on a hateful worldview that legitimately contributes to harm. We may have spent the whole first part of this series dissecting Neku's worldview, but it's pretty clear that he never put half as much thought into it as we did in that video. He just thought the best way to enjoy his life was to focus only on himself, and that's about as far as he really took it. Joshua, on the other hand, seems to share Neku's conclusions, but his dialogue indicates that he knows exactly why he holds those beliefs. Neku just wanted to do his own thing and didn't care about other people. Joshua's here to tell him why that's actually a great idea. He even plays off of one of Neku's darker moments in week 1 in a rather revealing way. During the conversation with Shiki, Beat, and Rhyme about how Shibuya is a battlefield of ideas, we mentioned in the first video that Neku valued his invisibility to the people around him, saying it's like a dream. And for a second, he wondered, if I survive the 7 days, does the dream end? For a second there, Neku literally wondered if the silence and solitude of death was better than the need to be around other people. It's a very understated moment, but it has some incredibly dark implications for where Neku's worldview could ultimately lead him. In a conversation with Joshua on day 5, he explains that he's here because, growing up able to see the goings-on in the UG, he began to see its charm. People racing across the city in a life-or-death struggle, Find me another rush like that in Shibuya. Life for me was one giant bore, just the same thing, day after day. Now that felt like death. I decided I belonged in the UG. Joshua chose this. He's not here to restore something he lost or to gain a second chance at life. He's here in the UG playing the game because he legitimately believes that this is better than living in the real world. That one dark musing that Neku had, Joshua has made that willingly into his entire life. Which is why Joshua is possibly the greatest threat to Neku in this entire game. Any of you who have undergone a major change in your worldview at some point know how fragile one can be during that process. Neku is in the process of trying to become a better person, and he could go either way at this point. And Joshua's here trying to push him in the wrong direction. Thankfully, as we established in that pattern a bit ago, Neku's experiences with Shiki had a profound enough effect on him that when Joshua is here constantly vocalizing Neku's old beliefs, that only serves to push Neku further in the direction that he needs to go, and he comes out of the other side of this trial stronger than before. We mostly see this in his simple refusal to let Joshua's cynicism be the last thought on his mind. As the week goes on, Neku responds internally to him by pushing back against what he's saying, thinking of his own experiences and connections during the game as lived proof against what Joshua is saying. And when even Joshua, this little douche nozzle who's constantly talked down to him, lied to him, ended up not only far more trustworthy than he seemed, but even sacrificed himself to save Neku, that seemed to cement the improved worldview that Neku had been working on accepting, resulting in the ultimate confirmation of Neku's progress. All the players from these games were taken as his entry fee for the next week, as the thing he values most. So what is this improved worldview? Well, this is the week when the game gives it to us most plainly, and it starts with Neku's fascination with Cat. Neku sees Cat's work as an extension of his philosophy, enjoy every moment with all you've got, and Neku has taken that philosophy to heart, or at least his misinterpretation of it. This phrase, enjoy every moment with all you've got, is, I think, rather intentionally something that could be interpreted in a number of different ways, but The World Ends With You seems primarily interested in the dichotomy between interpreting it in an exclusionary manner versus an inclusive one. That's the context in which it comes up, for the most part, and ultimately Neku's mistake in understanding this idea is that he interprets the phrase to be exclusionary rather than inclusive. This motto first comes up in a conversation between Mr. Hanakoma and Neku, in which Mr. H says these words, and Neku recognizes them as Cat's motto. The later revelation that Mr. H is Cat explains this, but that's not as important as the fact that the phrase actually means something wildly different from what Neku took it to mean. Neku believed that the key to enjoying every moment was to focus entirely on himself, to take every moment as his own, live for himself, and refuse to give those moments or their enjoyment to anyone else. And he lived his life based on that idea. But when he says that Cat's mantra is his personal creed, Mr. H's response is simply, could have fooled me, which is the point where we get the game's title drop. Listen up, phones, the world ends with you. If you want to enjoy life, expand your world. You gotta push your horizons out as far as they'll go. The game seems to revel in these phrases that could have multiple interpretations, as though it's intentionally alluding to the fact that we all see the world a bit differently, but it is absolutely advocating for a particular, albeit wildly open-ended, approach to life. The world ends with you could be interpreted to mean that the self is most important, just like enjoy every moment with all you've got could be understood to mean that you should focus on your own enjoyment above all else. But Mr. Hanakoma, in yet another scene where the game basically spells out its message, very intentionally sets out to reveal the foolishness of the way Neku interpreted these concepts. Neku interpreted them as insular, as affirmations that all he needed to be happy was himself and his values, but it's supposed to be the exact opposite. You don't enjoy every moment with all you've got by retreating into yourself, but by reaching out to others. And the world doesn't end with you because you're the only thing that matters, it ends with you because your understanding of it is only as big as you let it be. And we see the results of this improved outlook when Neku's entry fee for the next game is all of the other players, most of whom he's never even met. Just like his entry fee for week 2, this is a sign of how far he's come. I think he explains it best himself when Sato and Nao were erased. Sure, other players are strangers. Not just players, everyone. I don't know who they are, where they're from, what they care about. But since I came to the UG, I've talked with them a little. Got to know them a little. Felt them a little. Felt my world grow. Just a tiny, tiny bit. It's different now. They're not just some strangers. I can't shut them out like that. Neku learned a lot by the end of the first week, but it's the second week that really cements the new way he looks at the world. He not only learned to value other people in how he interacts with them, he's now learned to value other people just by their intrinsic value as human beings. He has now recognized the worth of people as a whole. And that's why all of them are taken as the thing that he values most. This week is also the one that contains most of the game's commentary on art and expression, but we'll save that for the next video since it's mostly contained in the side stories and characters, and that is what the next video is about. Thank you so much for continuing this journey with me. This game really means a lot to me, and I'm so glad to see all your responses so far. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and the little bell down there if you want to be alerted to when the next video comes out, and check the description if you want to follow Games as Lit 101 on social media or support the show on Patreon, which of course I always greatly appreciate. So until next time, class dismissed.